Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine.
Thank you very much. The computer textbooks of the 1980s told the readers that the fastest computer in the world must be powered by only one isolated processor. On the 4th of July, 1989, I discovered that the fastest computer in the world must be powered by thousands or millions or even billions of commodity off-the-shelf processors that were tightly coupled to each other, that were identical to each other, and that shared nothing between each other. That discovery made the news headlines and has been embraced by all computer scientists. That discovery is the vital technology that underpins every supercomputer. I'm Philip Emeagwali. To discover is to change the narrative of science. In my quest for the Holy Grail to the fastest supercomputers, I focused on the second law of motion of physics that was discovered 3 centuries earlier, which, however, had existed since the Big Bang explosion that occurred 13.8 billion years ago. Back in the early 1980s, I re-examined textbooks that described how the second law of motion of physics was encoded into a system of coupled, nonlinear, time-dependent, and 3-dimensional partial differential equations of calculus that governs 3-phase flows of crude oil, injected water, and natural gas that were flowing 1 mile deep underneath a production oil field that is the size of a town. During my supercomputer research, I re-examined mathematical physics textbooks that described how the second law of motion of physics was codified from the algebraic equation to the differential equation. What I discovered was an epiphany. I discovered that in its most important application, namely the recovery of crude oil and natural gas from production oil fields, that the second law of motion of physics was incorrectly represented. I discovered that each of the 9 partial differential equations within the system of coupled, nonlinear, time-dependent, and 3-dimensional partial differential equations encoded into petroleum reservoir simulators incorporated only 3 partial derivative terms. Those 3 calculus terms corresponded to 3 physical forces, and none corresponded to the 4th physical force that actually exists in the oil field being simulated. I discovered that those 3 physical forces could not equate to the actual 4 forces inside oil production petroleum reservoirs. My contribution to mathematical knowledge is this: I corrected those mathematical errors, and I corrected them by adding 36 partial derivative terms that corresponded to and accounted for the 36 components of the erroneously missing inertial forces. That was how I invented 9 partial differential equations that are the most advanced equations in mathematics and the most important expressions in calculus. I'm hopeful that the 9 partial differential equations that I contributed to mathematics will remain accurate over the centuries. The Philip Emeagwali system of partial differential equations should remain accurate because they encode the second law of motion of physics that in turn did not change since the Big Bang explosion, that is the beginning of time for our universe. As a research computational mathematician in quest for previously unseen partial differential equations, my research perspective was diametrically opposite to that of an applied mathematician that only wants to analyze known partial differential equations. In the 1980s, I attended 500 weekly research seminars, with the first half of those seminars occurring in the metropolitan areas of Washington, District of Columbia, and Baltimore, Maryland. Half of the seminar speakers were research mathematicians that came from faraway places such as Moscow, Russia, Paris, France, and London, England. During those seminars, I observed that research mathematicians either focus their analysis on known partial differential equations that has been described in calculus textbooks, or they were scribbling partial differential equations that has been scribbled before on a blackboard or coded before into a motherboard. I observed that research mathematicians of the 1970s approached initial boundary value problems from only one direction. That direction was to and from the mathematician's blackboard. The iconic Navier-Stokes equations is the favorite system of partial differential equations of the mathematical physicist. Being a physicist and a mathematician and a supercomputer scientist, I simultaneously approached my parallel processing research on how to solve the most computation-intensive algebraic approximations that arose from finite difference discretizations of partial differential equations and how to solve them from 4 directions. My 4 directions were from the storyboard of the physicist to the blackboard of the mathematician to the motherboard of the computer scientist and across the motherboards of the research supercomputer scientist. On the 4th of July 1989, I became the first parallel supercomputer scientist to record the world's fastest calculations. As the first parallel supercomputer scientist, I was mandated to solve the grand challenge problem of physics and mathematics and to solve it by parallel processing the grand challenge problem as 65,536 initial boundary value problems of extreme scale computational fluid dynamics. My grand challenge was to figure out how to chop up that real-world problem of extreme scale algebra and chop it up into 64 binary thousand smaller initial boundary value problems, and most importantly, figure out how to subsequently parallel process those computational physics problems and how to do so across my 2 raised to power 16 processors that were tightly coupled to each other and that shared nothing between each other. In the 1970s and 80s, I walked along a technological trail that was orthogonal to the trail that was walked by the vector processing supercomputer scientists. I walked alone. I walked through the darkness that was the unknown world of the massively parallel supercomputer that was the precursor to the modern computer. Metaphorically speaking, I walked within the unknown territory of the massively parallel supercomputer, and I walked with only a small lamp to see by. That lamp was the most massively parallel ensemble of processors ever built. The reason I was left alone to discover how to make an ensemble of 1 million processors solve 1 million problems at once was that it was then said that parallel processing is a huge waste of everybody's time. I walked through darkness and into the light and did so with equations. How are modern supercomputers used? 9 in 10 parallel processing cycles were consumed by extreme-scaled computational physicists. Their grand challenges include executing computational fluid dynamics codes that had the Navier-Stokes equations at their calculus core, or executing the petroleum reservoir simulator used to discover and recover otherwise elusive crude oil and natural gas, and the general circulation model used to foresee otherwise unforeseeable global warming. At the granite cause of most real-world problems arising in computational physics is the system of coupled nonlinear time-dependent and 3-dimensional partial differential equations of calculus that contains partial derivative terms that represented something in the physical problem the equations governed. Parallel processed supercomputing is the Formula One of science and technology. The fastest supercomputer in the world is 10 million times faster than your computer. The fastest supercomputer is powered by 10,649,600 cores that were totaled across 40,960 nodes. The supercomputer of 1946 was rated at 5,000 cycles per second that could be executed during an arithmetical operation on a 10-digit number. Today, the parallel supercomputer that can record a speed of 1 exaflops could be manufactured. The flop is the acronym for floating point arithmetical operations per second. Exascale supercomputing is achieved by massively parallel processing at the speed of 1 billion floating point arithmetical operations per second. That speed of supercomputing is equivalent to a quintillion or 10 raised to power 18 calculations per second. The fastest supercomputer speeds make it possible to create extreme scale and high fidelity computational fluid dynamics simulations Like any technology, the parallel supercomputer is a double-edged sword that can be used to do both good and bad things. The supercomputer is a vital instrument that is used to execute computational fluid dynamics codes that model blood flowing through the human cardiovascular system. The supercomputer that can be used for computational medicine and used to understand how to increase human longevity can also be used to design weapons of doom. The parallel supercomputer is used to design bombs that are more than 3,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb that was dropped upon the Japanese city of Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, that atomic bomb killed 166,000 Japanese. Because supercomputers are used to simulate nuclear explosions over cities like New York, the US is reluctant to sell American-made supercomputers to quote-unquote unfriendly nations. This security threat is the reason the US Department of Commerce vehemently objects whenever Japan sells a supercomputer to a nation that is unfriendly to the United States. This was the origin of the infamous supercomputer denial list that had been in existence since the 1950s, when it was against the law to export an American supercomputer to the Soviet Union. This, in part, is the reason that in the 1980s, I was the only Nigerian that was supercomputing within US nuclear research laboratories.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.